All right, we'll go on to our next and very timely presentation, a proactive local government red tide response example. This is from Pinellas County, and Paul Dean will be joining us to give the presentation. Next slide. Purpose is to provide an overview of the Red Tide Emergency Operational Response Program developed by Pinellas County to address the 2018 and 2020 bloom events. And this is tied to our CCMP, to the Water Quality Improvement Priority Action Area. So with that, I will turn this over to Mr. Dean. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Happy to be here. And like I was introduced, Paul Dean is my name, and it's Pinellas County Public Works. I'm a division director here and oversaw the operations of the 2021 red tide response. Next slide, please. During this presentation, I'll talk about in general, the challenges that we faced, talk about a response, breaking that into public outreach, and then also contractor management. And then I'll finish up with lessons learned and then have some time for questions. Next slide, please. So as you're aware, Pinellas County, we're a peninsula. We've got a lot of beaches, 35 miles of public beaches. These beaches, while they're mostly fairly good sized, they have limited access points, particularly for large equipment. So accessing all 35 miles of the beaches is difficult. In addition, we have 14 coastal cities that run along the beach areas. We have visitors, tourists still coming to the beach during these events. And we also have a lot of residential areas that abut the beach, homes coming up right up next to the beach that have that complain and have issues with the smell or the process we go through as we remove them. In addition to the coastal cities, we have a state park and 3 county parks that we also try to manage the coastline there. Away from the beaches, we have our intercoastal waterway that has many private docks, smaller canals, public canals, smaller canals, where fish, depending upon the tides and wind, will get washed up into, right next to seawalls. And you can see some of those pictures on the screen at the bottom right. Fish will get pushed back up into these areas next to mangroves, next to people's docks, and then we'll start getting calls from those. And that creates its own challenge in how to address and getting those out. We also have passes and inlets where the fish, dead fish move through, where red tide moves through as well. And lastly, sea turtle nesting along the beaches. Typically this happens, I believe it's May through October when the sea turtles are nesting on the beach, which typically has coincided with when our red tide events have happened. In order to respond, this limits us a little bit. Each morning we would have people go out and survey for sea turtle nesting action. And if we found sea turtles nesting, those areas were roped off. So as our crews and equipment went up and down the beaches, they weren't disturbed. But this did limit us in our response time, as we weren't able to get out there at first light sometimes. What we want to get out there as early as possible, but we need to make sure the beaches were clear for sea turtles. Next slide, please. Some of the other challenges, obviously, with the environment, devastation to marine life and also vegetation. We have a lot of dead seagrass that comes up as well. As Dr. Parsons talked about, trying to break the nitrogen cycle of these fish that are floating in the water, and also the ones that wash up on shore. Public health issues, beachgoers experience respiratory irritation on the beaches. The smell also is very bad. And depending upon the time of the day or the wind, it gets worse or it gets manageable. And then also economic impacts. People don't like going to the beach when there's a bunch of dead fish all around and it smells and it makes you cough and is irritating your throat, or potentially giving headaches depending upon how strong the aerosols were that day. Next slide, please. So some of the things that we did as we start the most recent, and I'll focus mostly on the 2021 response, but some of these things we started in 2018 as well when we first responded. One of the primary things we utilize is media outreach. Our public information officer office was very impactful and helpful. We would schedule media outreach interviews with county employees, with the PIO, or with our contractor to talk about the steps that we were taking to get out the information that we needed to the public in general about what was going on and what they could expect if they went to the beach. One of the big things we also tried to push them towards was our social media sites. So we had a very active Facebook and Twitter accounts and the county website. So anytime we had the media around, we would make sure that we would direct citizens to go to these sites so that they would be able to find out information and timely information that would be updated daily. So they would be able to be aware of what they're walking into if they're going to the beach, or which beach they should go to if it wasn't, if red tide wasn't active at a certain location. Some of the biggest tools that we were pushing people to, and probably the most helpful one was our GIS Citizens app. And actually out of these three, it's the one that's at the very top, says Red Tide Community Cleanup Efforts. This was an app that citizens could access from our website. They could download it. And then on their phones, when they were out and about, if they were at the beach or if they lived along one of our barrier islands or along one of the shorelines, they could take pictures and they could report fish kills as they find them. This was extremely helpful as we had a small crew, 3 to 4 inspectors every day who would then respond to these, who would go out and look at them. The pictures were very helpful because you would be able to see sometimes citizens would put in a report and you'd look at the picture and it'd be 2 or 3 fish, nothing very serious. But other times you'd look and it'd be, thousands of fish in a very small area, which is then when we try to get our contractor up and running and get out to those areas specifically. But that also allowed us to go out, inspect the areas, which we would communicate back to our operations on shore. But then we could also reach out to the citizens as well and letting them know that we followed up or asking them secondary follow-up questions as needed. And so I think in that way, it helped us engage the citizens, engage those who were stopping by the beach, to help them feel like they were a part of the solution as well. And I think that turned out really well, especially when we were able to follow up with them, letting them know that we've sent somebody out there, or we're going to send somebody out there to respond. The next one is dumpster locations, and that's the image to the far right there. We had a lot of citizen groups, beach communities that also wanted, and municipalities that wanted to participate in the cleanup. Part of our contract, we had dumpsters at specific points, depending upon where we were cleaning up or where red tide was most active. Our contractor managed those dumpsters, but we would put the locations on the map so cities and individuals would know if they wanted to go do a cleanup, this is an area that they could dump fish in. We didn't have any issues with people dumping other things, but we had citizens who would go out. If they lived along the beach, they might go out in their on the beach access area that they had, and they might go out with a bucket and pick up fish and then go dump it in one of these dumpsters instead of putting it in their own garbage can. So that was another useful tool. And the final two, respiratory forecasts and water quality monitoring, were things that we would push out depending upon where the respiratory issues were. What we would go out daily and monitor for water quality, for the intensity of red tide. And depending upon those things, we would mark those things down. And that actually allowed a lot of citizens, if they looked at different areas along the coast, you might have Clearwater Beach being hit hard, but maybe the southern part of the county wasn't being hit hard. So citizens were able then to look at that, and they could choose which beaches they wanted to go to, if because not all the beaches would be impacted at all times. Next slide, please. With our contractor management response, when this first happened in 2018, we didn't have a plan. And we used our debris management contractor that we use for for FEMA events. We contacted them and came up with a plan and did an amendment to the contract to add new equipment and new manpower to that, and utilize that contract. And I'll talk more about our operations in a little bit. Some of the other things that were very important: aerial support. We had the Sheriff's Office, the Coast Guard, and FWC that all helped us support this effort. We would send up an employee at least twice weekly They would fly, depending upon who we were going with, they could fly different routes, but they would fly and they'd be able to spot particularly large offshore, we call them rack lines, floating fish would tend to congregate, dead fish would congregate offshore. And then depending upon the wind or tides, we might move inshore or move up some of the canals. Having these flights allowed us to spot those and then actually direct our operations to those areas. We also had NOAA satellite imagery, USF modeling that helped us try to predict where the fish were going to be or what was going to happen, so we could communicate that out with our contractor and also plan to make sure we can address the right areas. And lastly, harvesting fish offshore, near shore, and on beaches. We found it was best to harvest them offshore. It was easiest, and we could collect more offshore with less impact to the citizens. Obviously, once it gets on shore, we're dealing with citizens. We're trying to pick them up on the beach, and there were some other difficulties. Next slide, please. So really, when we talk about our response, it breaks down into either beach operations or vessel operations. On beach operations, we typically had hand crews, and hand crews would typically do areas that were sparsely, there wasn't very many fish, a few fish every feet, maybe. We'd send them there. They could travel quickly up and down the beach and do areas that weren't impacted heavily. They also would do those areas that had large fish that weren't able to be picked up if a Goliath grouper or something washed up on shore. They would respond to those areas. Bottom left picture shows our beach rake. We had typically it was a tractor pulling a beach rake that would run up and down the shore for any areas that were heavily, had a heavy fish kill wash up. We used the beach rake, was able to pick them up much faster, and that would work in tandem with the front loader. So it would drive back and forth. Once it was full, it would offload into a front loader who would then run to one of the dumpster sites and then come back as the beach rake continued to work. Occasionally, we would also have the hand crews and the beach rakes work in tandem. The beach rakes work best in dry sand. So obviously, as tide's going out, it's leaving fish on shore. Sometimes it was best if we would send the hand crews ahead to help rake some of the dead fish up away from the waves a little bit, away from the wet sand, into the drier sand where the beach rake could be more effective in picking them up. For our vessel operations, we use 4 types of vessels. We use large shrimp boats, and those are typically slow and didn't move real fast and weren't very agile. We kept those offshore. They could pick up large amounts of the floating fish before they reached the shoreline or reached the beach. And so those were very effective, and typically that's what we were directing after our flights. We'd come back and direct those to different areas where we saw a lot of floating fish. We also had smaller shrimp boats. Those could operate in the intercoastal waterways. We're more agile and we're able to get some of those places close and also collect a lot of fish. Lastly, we had what we called we-dos. It's that top right picture. They're these little small manned boats that could get right up next to seawalls, collect under docks. And those were very valuable, specifically in those small, tight canals around the dock areas. And those would work in tandem. Typically, we might have one or a couple of those working with a support boat who would collect the dead fish and run that to our offloading site. And so that way the we-dos were able to continue to work, and we'd have that boat work back, move back and forth to support them. Next slide, please. One of the things we did try to do is we tried to utilize local resources, local shrimpers, local captains as support as much as possible. The way that we found best to do this is we had our contractor and we had a link on our website directly to our contractor if there was a captain who wanted to participate, who was impacted by red tide and was looking for another option while they couldn't go fishing. This site allowed them to access our contractor site and become a subcontractor. This helped us just because of the efficiency of getting people on, the local fishermen as part of our response, and allowed us not to have to come up with new contracts or manage when they were working and when they weren't. So we were able to get quite a lot of interest. We were able to get the boats out through our contractor, and they worked as subcontract directly with them. Next slide, please. Some of the biggest things that were important is daily coordination. We'd have morning meetings with the contractor, where we'd talk about where locations needed to be at, what we were seeing from the air, or what was being reported by citizens. This allowed us to ramp up and ramp down quickly, and saved us a lot of money. And it's very important also to track costs for reimbursement. We received a grant through FDEP. Overall, in 2018, 3.7 million pounds was collected, and in 2021, 3.6 million pounds. And we got much more efficient. I think although 2018 was a longer duration, we ended up spending 7.5 million in 2018, and in 2021, the total cost was 3 million. And I think that was because we focused more offshore, which was more effective in picking up fish. And it was a shorter time period as opposed to 2018, which seemed to last a lot, much longer. But we also tried to ramp up and ramp down accordingly. Next slide, please. And just lessons learned quickly. Strengthen partnerships. If we didn't have the partners with the local resources and different agencies and governments, we wouldn't have been able to respond well. Have a plan and be ready. Since 2018, we developed a red tide response plan, and as part of our overall emergency response. And moving forward, our debris contract is still active, but it expires in a year. And we're going to move forward with an RFP just for red tide response. Communication is critical. And then lastly, it does give an opportunity for enhanced outreach and education of citizens. Through this communication, letting them know, hey, with impacts, hey, keep your water clean with our fertilizer issues that we have, and trying to move that forward. Next slide. That's all that I have. If there's any questions.
Paul, thank you so much for joining us. We do have time for maybe a couple of questions if anybody wants to come on.
I just want to note that as part of the agenda packet, both the RFP, the scope, different resources that Pinellas has developed to have these emergency response services at the ready are attached to your agenda packet in case you're interested in pursuing that with your own municipality. And I'm sure Paul would be happy to be a resource to give us, more ideas on like lessons learned and where you're headed, Paul, because I know you're in the midst of renewing that, right?
Yes, we are. Yeah, we're in the process of doing that, and we're happy to share how that goes. If any other municipality is interested, also if you're looking for resources or how we did the citizen engagement app or some of those other things, please reach out. I can get you in contact with our GIS group and help coordinate some of that information as well.
Paul, I really appreciate the details you shared, not just some of the overall activities, but kind of what worked, what didn't, equipment-wise, where you needed just muscle to get stuff done. I think it's very informative to kind of get ideas flowing of how we can all work to reduce this. And it was clear from the last presentation just kind of how timely things need to be, that the impact of the cleanup can be great in the first couple of days, and as you get close to a week out, how much of the nutrients have already been released, and how the actual impact can be slowed by a quick response. So thank you very much for joining us and sharing the lessons you learned and activities that you've taken part of. Very, very informative.
Thank you, guys.